Yeah, we're live. Right. Oh, 7:01. It just clicked over from 7 o'clock to 7:01. I'm back from one of my many trips to West Tech Performance, and it was as always, it's always awesome down there to get down there and see those guys. Thank you to Eric and Ish for helping me get that thing, getting the Magnum up and running and making it work, which was great. Sometimes when you have a junkyard motor, you you don't really know. The problem is that, and we go through some steps with, we check and make sure that it has oil pressure. We make sure that it has compression in all the holes, but even after doing that, you don't really know that it's alive until it's actually alive. So you got to go through the whole procedure of getting the thing working, hooking up all of the fuel injection and the fuel lines and the cooling hoses and all that stuff that you have to go through. And I have a video coming up that I'm doing on that, on what was entailed, what we had to go through to take this motor from the junkyard that I got, basically, and the prep that was needed to make it work. A lot of things people don't think about. For instance, we had the factory injectors in there. Now, if the motor just runs and starts up, and that's all great. But before we do that, we don't want to take a lot of time while we're on the dyno to figure out a lot of problems. So what we do, things like, I took the injectors out and we cleaned them, and we also flowed them because I wanted to make sure that they were all the same. We wanted to make sure, first of all, that they were even working. And as it turned out, they were. Then we don't want to make sure also that they all flowed the same, that you didn't have any lazy ones. I mean, the motor's fairly old. I think that this one was a 98 or 99 or something. And it came from I think a 1500 Dodge Ram. Yeah, I think that's about right. But we want to make sure that they're all the same, because there's nothing more frustrating than when you're trying to tune it. And you're trying to tune, we're using a lambda meter that tells us what the air fuel is. And if we're trying to tune that, and you have one injector that's lazier than the others and not doing what it's supposed to be doing in that cylinder, not supplying enough fuel, obviously the air fuel in that cylinder is not going to be working out. And the same thing, it's hard to tune around mechanical problems like that. Same thing if we didn't have, if the compression was way low in one of the cylinders because it was leaking past the rings, or it had bad valves. Trying to tune around that is a problem. And having not run a Dodge Magnum 360 from the junkyard on the dyno before, I don't really have a frame of reference. So if it makes 200 horsepower, I go, well, is that kind of what it's supposed to make? I mean, we have a fair idea based on what the rated power output, and we would compare that to the rated power output of other motors that we've run relative to what it makes on the engine dyno the way that we tested. Because when we're running the Magnum, like the other ones, we don't run the accessories, so there's no accessories on it. We normally would run a Mazir electric water pump, but in this case, we just left the factory water pump on there, and we just force-fed water through the motor, a lot like we do on a lot of the boat motors. So I'm just like with the 4200, we did that initially too. But what I want to do is get like an alternator bracket and a tensioner and stuff, so that I can go ahead and at least run the factory water pump. And that way we can run it at a little higher temperature and stuff. But we have to do that. We have to make sure that the exhaust manifolds work, and that we route exhaust from the exhaust manifolds, obviously, back to the back of the dyno with those extension pipes that we have to make, because we didn't get the full exhaust or even a portion of the exhaust from the wrecking yard. The problem is that they normally come in just do a big hydraulic scissor cut on the exhaust, and they cut off all of the cats and stuff and take that stuff away, because you can't buy those at the wrecking yard. So we only have a section of the exhaust left, which is nice when you're making a turbo setup, because if you have the stock exhaust manifolds and then you have a section of pipe, that's the beginning of of a lovely turbo section, of a lovely turbo kit, because then you can configure the rest of your Y pipe off of that, which we might do in the future. So we have to make that, and then you have to put provisions for oxygen sensors in there, because you obviously want to be able to tune it. So having the O2 sensor in there, so a lot goes into making that thing work on the dyno, and all of that is just, it's just time. And the actual tuning part of it, like making it work, is not hard at all. I mean, normally that's 5 or 6 poles, and the wide open throttle stuff, we know what the thing's going to make. It repeats every time. We sweep it through different timing levels. We sweep it through different air fuel levels to see how receptive it is to, does it make peak power at 13.0, or does it not care that it's 13.0 or 12.8 or 12.5 or even 12.0 sometimes. Same thing with timing. In this case, we started out with 25 degrees of timing, which turned out to actually be fairly close to what this thing wanted. We tried 27 and it picked up a little bit. We tried 28 and it just didn't seem to care after that, which I thought was fairly low timing for this motor, given the fact that it's it's still even though the Magnum head is better than the LA head, it's still not a really modern cylinder head, and it's certainly not a 4-valve head. So I was a little surprised that it only wanted that much timing. But it was very cool to get it's very cool to see the thing run, to have it come to life and actually work. Because when you fire it up for the first time and it has oil pressure and you get the idle tune correct and get the timing right and stuff, and to start off with, we just put 25 degrees of timing everywhere, and we know that it will start like that. And it's nice to hear it roar to life, and then to have it idle steady and do all of those things. Knocked my camera there. It's a really good feeling to have that happen. The same thing with a carbureted motor. If you hit it twice with the throttle and then start it up, it's always great to hear it start up and come to life, and you're like, yeah, yes, this is a good one. Because I have a lot of motors right now that are all apart, and so a lot of these have not worked out for one reason or another. And it was nice to try this. So we tried a few different things on it with the amount of time that I had to get all of this testing done. So I was able to run long tube headers on it. We were able to run, obviously we were able to tune the thing. We were able to run, we even tried nitrous on it. If you guys saw, if you follow me on Instagram, if you don't, you should. I posted up what our custom nitrous setup looked like. Because as you guys know, on this Magnum, it has the big beer keg intake manifold, which I hope to do some testing with. We can take a look at some of the mods that they make to those. And after looking at them, we're not expecting, I'm honestly, given the amount that they're changing the runner length, it's not very significant. So I might try a more significant change. We'll have to see how that works out. But it'll be interesting to see what those normal beer keg modifications are, what kind of changes they're capable of, especially because we have a standalone management system and allows us to dial in the air fuel and timing. So if you change the runner length, even by 2 or 3 inches, you'll see a change in power, and you should typically lose low speed power and then gain power a little more on the top. I was very happy with how much power the motor made and how high it revved and all that, because this beer keg manifold on the Magnum 360 is an awful lot like, if you're an LS guy, it would be an awful lot like the truck manifold, or even if before that, it would be a lot more like the tune port stuff on the L98 on the 350 Chevys, because the OEMs knew that long runner stuff really enhances torque production. And for the RPM range that motor is going to run, which is obviously designed to enhance torque production and be used in a heavy truck for towing applications, long runners are definitely the way to go. And the beer keg is not short on long runners. So it worked very well. And I tried to figure out a couple of ways to run bigger throttle bodies on it. And we took a look at some adapters while I was running this. We took a look at some 2-barrel to 4-barrel adapters to see if any of those were close to lining up. I also took a look at some of the other 2-barrel style throttle bodies, like with the Ford modular motor and stuff, to see if there's anything that was a direct retrofit. I was even thinking about cutting the divider out of the center and putting an oval throttle body on it. Honestly, given what the manifold flows and the runner length, I don't know how throttle limited it is, given the factory power output. But those are all things that I want to test. And then obviously after that, you would start looking at the normal kind of modifications too, the same thing that you do to any V8, and especially one that is limited in head flow. So think more small block Chevy than LS. The LS factory stuff has fairly good heads on it. So if you put a cam in it, you can make fairly good power. If we put a cam in the Magnum, you know, it's a head that probably flows closer to 200 CFM, we're going to get kind of predictable results. It'd be more like putting a cam in a Vortec small block Chevy. One of the other tests that I wanted to do that I didn't get to do while we were there is I wanted to run a dual plane carbureted intake and compare that to the big Kegger intake manifold, the EFI intake, which I will be doing that. So I have a number of other tests coming up that will be testing that. I was also happy that it seemed like the bottom plate, the cover plate on the Kegger manifold was not leaking, at least not significantly. And we were able to get our testing done without having to worry about that. There does look like there's some oil in there, but I don't know if that's from the PCV system. Almost all the intakes on any sort of fuel injected motor like that, if you look inside an LS motor, an LS intake manifold, look inside an LS truck intake manifold, it's full of oil, especially after running 100 or 200 or 300,000 miles. They do accumulate a lot of that stuff. So it's, you know, it's a good idea to flush those things out. But I'm excited about doing the beer cake. I'm also excited about doing some other stuff we want to do. And obviously with the Magnum, we can look at porting the stock head. We can look at the Engine Quest iron head upgrades. There are also aftermarket heads that we can run. TrickFlow has some really good stuff. I'm sure Edelbrock probably has the Dodge heads as well. There are a variety of different intake manifolds. And then obviously we can run boost too. I can take the stock exhaust manifolds and create a super Richie dyno turbo kit for it. And we can run a single turbo on there. We can run it fuel injected with the Kegger manifold. Maybe I'm thinking maybe an elbow on there and cut the throttle opening bigger and then put an elbow on there. You know, there's all kinds of cool things that we can try. I just don't want to try too many things that would not be representative of what other people would be able to run if they have that EFI manifold, because they're mostly going to do a mild cam and headers and maybe the Kegger upgrades. Because if you're really wanting to make power, you're probably going to get rid of that manifold. And we know from previous testing on a lot of other combinations that if we have a given NA power curve that we add a turbo to that it's still going to be that power curve, the same curve shape. It's just going to be more of that as we add boost. So I'm hoping that the Dodge responds as well as all the rest of the motors have. And it will be kind of cool to do it. And naturally, the other thing that's going to happen with this motor is this is going to be the piston flip motor. So we'll be able to reverse the pistons and find out if indeed there is any power, which is the other reason that I want to get the accessory drives to be able to drive the water pump, because we want to run it at some kind of temperature. Even if it's 150 or 160 degrees, the water temperature has to be perfectly stable if we're going to do this piston flip test, because the water temp has to be perfectly stable. The oil temperature does, the temperature in the room, obviously, everything has to be, perfectly repeatable. Because if we're looking for anywhere from no power to very little power, very little change in power, either a gain or a loss, we have to make sure that the thing that we test, the thing that we're changing, is responsible for that and not something else that's going on. We can obviously make the air fuel exactly the same. We make the timing exactly the same. In fact, where we won't even change the timing, and I won't even change the air fuel. When we do the swap, we'll start out there, and then if we see, hey, look, it's making 5 more horsepower, 10 more horsepower, and then we'll have to adjust it to make sure that the air fuel is the same. I don't run these under a closed loop and have them self-tune. I like to do it myself. But everything else obviously has to be consistent, and the thing has to be dead repeatable within 1 horsepower. Because if we're only looking for a change of 1 horsepower and the thing isn't repeatable enough to within 1 horsepower, you just don't know what happened. And honestly, if it's 1 horsepower, we're going to call that it's not much of a change. So it'll be interesting to see. I like the Magnum. I like every time I get to test something new. I think it's cool. I would honestly, once we get a program working where it seems like that this thing's going to work and work well and keep running, it would be interesting to compare the 318 to the 360 to show what the difference is in in torque production. Now, if anybody knows, I haven't looked it up online. I'm sure the information's there, but I'd like to find out if there's a difference in the cam profile between the 360 Magnum and the 318 Magnum. You know, because we can, if I wanted to really nitpick this thing and show the difference between the displacement, we could make the compression the same and make the camshaft the same, and they both have this beer keg intake manifold, and I'm assuming that the exhaust manifolds probably are similar, if not exactly the same. There's no reason that they couldn't be exactly the same. So I like doing those kinds of comparisons. The same, I'm sure the Dodge guys would like that, because when I did I know it was very popular when I did the 4.8 versus the 5.3 versus the 6.0 and versus the 6.2, even when we did them all stock, people loved having that information. And I think it would be interesting too, for the people out there, and Uncle Tony, you know who you are, the guys that think, you know, that the 318 is really the way to go, that it's a better motor, that it makes as much power as a 360, and it just won't. You know, a 4.8 doesn't make as much power as a 5.3. And a 5.3 doesn't make as much power as a 6.0. Only after you modify them will they make equivalent power to the bigger displacements. The one exception to that, and we saw that in the video that I have up on the 302, 327, and 350 muscle car motors, the LT1 and the L76, and then the DZ302, is they all made comparable peak power. They did it at different RPMs because the smaller motor like the 302 has to make power at a higher engine speed. And because they're limited in head flow, and in that case, you know, probably cam timing and induction too, there might be a case for the smaller motor working out a little better. So it's always an interesting test. Honestly, for driving around in the street, the bigger motor is just gonna, you know, they're usually a better way to go because they make so much more torque. And we saw that on the Chevy version of that test. And doing it on doing it on the Dodge side would be interesting. The other thing that now this allows me to do is although I haven't ever run a small block Chevy, a Vortec small block Chevy with the factory injection. I'm not sure how we do that. Maybe that's an easy thing. Maybe Eric can make that work. But I'd like to compare that and do a Ford, Chevy, Dodge thing and find out, because I don't know how much different that Vortec factory fuel injection is, the plastic intake manifold setup. I don't know how much different that is than a typical dual plane. Obviously, I could run them all with dual plane intakes as well, and that would be an additional good part of the test as a secondary thing. But I'd like to run them all kind of stock as well and find out. This Dodge did very well, and I think that this Magnum probably would be right in line with the small block Chevy, and probably, as a spoiler, probably both of those are going to be better than the Ford. So that's what we got going on, and I was able to run nitrous on it, and the nitrous stuff worked very well. I say worked very well. What I mean is it didn't do exactly what we thought, and I don't know why. Obviously, nitrous always adds power. We don't have a problem with that. But when we ran the nitrous, and I'm doing a video on that, and you guys will see that, it'll be up the next day or so. What we did on the nitrous is, rather than run a typical wet fogger setup, because I don't have anything that mates readily to the dual throttle opening, not just the throttle body, because that's fairly easy. We could put a stack above it, which we had a stack. I had an air stack that we used. And it's one that I use. It has history too. It has history back from when I was doing the show with Chad, where we were doing Wheel of Death. And so it's basically just a stack air cleaner assembly. And what we did is we had a 5-gallon bucket perched above it, and because it made it up just perfectly. And then I made a cool flapper door on the 5-gallon bucket so that we could have the motor at wide open throttle at 5,000 RPM and then open the bucket and dump 5 gallons of water into the motor while it was running and hydrolock it and show what the damage that is. And by the way, you don't need 5 gallons of water to do that. And it stops the motor instantaneously. So we had that air intake on there. But the thing is that if you know anything about the Dodge, the Kegger manifold, not only does it have it has a dual hole throttle body, and then it has 2 openings in the manifold, but it's actually divided in the manifold as well. So we had to make sure that we got enough nitrous going to, we had to have an even amount roughly going to each one of them. Now, we could have done a twin fogger setup, but I didn't have 2 fogger nozzles available to me at the time. So we did one, and I just did an interesting mounting configuration for it. And then also what I did was, because I was concerned with the kegger manifold and the convoluted path that the nitrous and fuel has to take. The nitrous isn't as much of a problem because it's gaseous, but the fuel is, even though it's called gas, is more of a liquid. And it would have trouble maneuvering through all of that, similar to the problem that we had when we ran the water meth injection on the LS intake manifold. So I was worried about distribution. So what we did was we activated, even though the fogger nozzle that we were using was a wet fogger, we just used the nitrous portion of it, and then we activated. We had a dry nitrous setup, basically. We just had nitrous being injected on the top, and then we added the fuel with the injectors, which is a good way to go. And I figured that way, and we spaced the nozzle far enough away that it was, you know, the spray cone, the pattern was covering both of the holes. So I figured, the motor's going to ingest the right amount of nitrous that it wants to do. And it did, and it worked. You know, it didn't seem quite as happy as we've had other nitrous combinations work. And I don't know if it was a tune issue, or maybe the fact that we used a set of spark plugs that were actually hotter than a factory plug, which is probably not ideal. But, you know, that's all part of the fun learning curve. So that's my discussion on Dodge stuff. So let's get to some questions and see what you guys are doing, what you guys have to say about the Magnum stuff. And we're definitely going to run, as I said, we are going to run boost on it as well. And then maybe down the line, I mean, the nice thing about the Dodge 360 is that you can make, 410s or 408s or strokers out of them too. And so then they can definitely make good power. I was talking to Dulcich on the way back when I was driving back from West Tech, and talking to him about maybe borrowing some parts to do some testing with and stuff too. So I'm excited about it. So what do you guys got going on? Keith thinks that the Dodge 318 Magnum has a larger cam than the 360 Magnum. That'd be interesting. Do Magnum heads outflow the legendary 340X head? I don't know. I would like to see if that's the case. If a 340X head flows, and I think it's actually a J head, but with the offset rocker on it. But I think that those probably flow. I'm thinking that those flow comparable to the Magnum head. And that they're kind of be like a fuely Chevy head. Yeah, let's get those likes up, yo. David, I have a V10 Dodge as well. The money pit I put in the 360 is about the V10 has for power, and the V10 was on ethanol additive with a Paxton supercharger. Tilt question about camshaft overlap. With a couple of degrees of overlap, how much air escapes out the exhaust? Would it cause false VE readings calculated with math? Probably not. The thing you have to think about is, even though there is overlap, you have to look at the overlap over time. And actually having overlap is going to increase power output. And if you're thinking that the air that's escaping would give you a false VE reading, I don't really think that that's the case, because they use, but all of the math, all the factory math stuff is going to be based on calculations for very mild cams. They're going to have no overlap. I don't know. Saul. I don't know how much would be escaping. That's an interesting question. 340 head flow is 189. Okay. 4.62 valve versus 5.2 Magnum versus 4.8 Vortex. So 4.8 the LR4 then? A 4.62 valve is not going to be He's not going to do well in that competition. I have a race 340 with W2s. Those are going to be a lot better than the factory head. Where are the EQ heads? I do want to get a set of those. I know in talking to Derek over at L&R Engines, the guy does a bunch of machine work for me, I asked him about the heads, and he said it's probably like 99% chance that when you take the heads off that they're going to be cracked. He said, so if you're going to put work into them, he said, you should just get Engine Quest heads. And I would like to do a back-to-back test. Talking to Dulcich, he said the Engine Quest heads are better than the factory heads. So I'd like to try one of those or a set of those just out of the box with the valve job and valves and stuff in it and see how it does. And then maybe do a kind of a better one. The W2 flow is 242. That's a big step up. So Derek wants to see a Hughes cam. I can talk to them about that. I have a 318 Magnum and a 94 Dakota with a 2-barrel Holley on the Kegger manifold. So you ran a 2-barrel carburetor on that Kegger manifold? Did you do some kind of adapter to make that work? Because I know that the throttle spacing, the bore size is different. Yeah, the Magnum heads outflow the LA heads. And the Magnum motor makes more power too. Mopar performance book on the Magnum engine should tell you about the cams. Okay, Dan, I have some Mopar books here I can take a look at. I just haven't looked it up yet. Can you do a stock versus little things test? Same top end, bottom end, but play with compression, roller rockers, 7mm valve stems. That's a really difficult test. Radius valve job, port matching, fuel ignition timing. What does balance the cam? You mean like dynamically balance it, like spin balance it? '65 Musi, having a real problem. Small block Ford vintage cross ram, runs fine with throttle open. Slowly turns off at light throttle. Will stop running at 1800 RPM. Reversion. I don't think that that's a reversion problem. Can you send me a picture of that? I'll put my email down here. I'd like to see that and see what you're talking about. Also, part of the test, add a crankcase vacuum pump. You want a crankcase? You want a vacuum pump on a stock motor? Billy, Vans. I didn't see what Van's question was. Speedmaster has a set of cast. Does Speedmaster have cast aluminum mat heads? Saul, having more than 100% VE is not unheard of. As a matter of fact, it's quite common. The reason that the VE is so high is one of the reasons is because you're getting this reflected wave is a perfect example of this. The reflected wave in the intake manifolds add a supercharging effect. So the amount of air that you're drawing in is you're getting some supercharging effect. So if you can have VE numbers that are way over 108 on some of these really spicy motors. Michael, speaking of vacuum pumps, is it true that a smog pump from a Ford truck can be used for crankcase vacuum? You can. I've seen guys do that. And there is one, and I can't remember what application it was on. There was an electric one that you could use, which would be the best one so that you don't have to spin it. Noodles, glad you're here, man. We used a spacer, re-drilled it to the kegger pattern. Okay, that makes sense. Would like to see a Hughes cam with different intakes. Steven, I don't know if the 488 V10, the non-Viper version, are those heads comparable to the Magnum head? Racer X Garage, the Holly 2-barrel is probably talking about is the fact that the stock 2-barrel throttle body has Holly printed on it. That's because they made them. So Dan, you've tried the smog case vacuum. Yeah, you don't want to do too much though. Yeah, Dan, cutting the intake runners will definitely help. It'll do the predictable thing. It will shift the power curve. The thing that I haven't seen anybody do on these kegger mods is what they do is lop off. They do a triangle cut on the end of it. And then sometimes they'll cut the divider out, which you can do, which will change the plenum volume. And then whenever they do this plenum volume change, they're talking about, oh yeah, and we're increasing port velocity, which those two things have nothing to do with each other. And they're only cutting, like I said, an inch or two off of the runner by doing that angle cut on it. And then they're, radius in the entry and stuff. Extrude honing that thing would be really, really good. I might talk to those guys about doing that, because then we can get the flow rate up, which I think that judging by the flow numbers that people are giving on these, they probably are flow limited also, in addition to being really long. But what I'd like to do, and I hadn't seen anybody online, I was, going down the rabbit hole searching all of this stuff. The kegger mod I want to see is I want to see somebody cut in about midway in the runner. So let's cut the runner length in half. If we're going to make a change in runner length, let's make a change in runner length. Let's not make 2 inches. We know what that does. I've done those kind of step tests a lot. Let's cut it down to, from, I don't know, 18 inches to 9 inches or something. Let's make a big change and see what that does. See if that's like too much. Do we kill all the low speed power, which we probably will. But then we got to make the opening into that section that we cut out. We have to make that fairly effective. So I just think it would be fun. L98 heads versus Vortex. The Vortex flows more. Yeah, Dan, we don't ever try to get 25 inches of crankcase vacuum. Evan, heard of putting more restrictive heads on. See, that's a myth that restrictive heads are going to help ultra low speed torque. I don't think that actually happens. In the testing that I've done on all the heads that we've done, even bigger heads added low speed torque. So I think that there's more to it than just bigger and smaller. A Junkyard V8 Holden, that's going to be really hard for me to find here. Yeah, the Engine Quest heads are not a cheap deal anymore. Yeah, you can tell them. Yeah, we talked about that. We can use a smog pump. Yeah, Pro Stockers would be at 120% VE. That's a lot. Aaron, if we use the Speedmaster heads, they're LA heads, though. But we won't be able to use the Magnum intake, though, right? Isn't the intake pattern different? So Noodles, the Barras had electric. Oh, the 4200. Okay. I won't be doing a big bang with this 360, but it's something we could do, I guess. What is the rev ceiling on a 360 with the best parts? Well, look what they did with cup style Magnum or cup style Chrysler motors. When they were running LA based motors, you could rev them to the moon. Yeah, Racer X. There's different ways to do it. If an LS is going to be cheaper, then it's easier to get the power out of it because it already has a lot of stuff going in. Use the dual. Jeremy's saying use the dual plane multi-point intake on it. You lose some low speed torque, but pick up a good amount of horsepower. That's my guess. As I suspect that the dual plane versus the kegger will go a lot like the dual plane versus the tune port test that I did on the Chevys. Yes, more cubic inches definitely adds low speed power, as does boost does as well. I did find a bell housing. I'm buying one from somebody for the 2.2 Dodge. So that's more Dodge information. We had 2 dead holes in the GLHS, unfortunately. But I have the other one. And actually right now I'm taking the 2.2 that I got from the Dodge 600, and we're going to go through it and make sure that it's, I don't want to put it on the dyno and have something be bad on it and not be able to go through the test. I'd rather spend a little bit of money and make sure that it's right. That way, when we get it on there, everything's working, and we can make sure that we can go through a big series of tests. Yeah, we can put a turbo on anything. So a turbo on this is going to act like it does on any motor that makes this kind of power. Use a dual pattern intake. There are dual pattern intakes, which would be good. Bigger valves should give better flow and swirl. The swirl by itself will help low end. Bigger valves often don't help low speed. The bigger heads even speed power, but they probably won't feel that same way. Wide open throttle, that's all well and good, but at part throttle, that's where I think plenum volume or port volume has a bigger effect. I installed an NOS 150 plate system on my ZZ502 stock ring gaps. That's fine. We've actually run more than that on stock ring gap stuff. I like adding a ring gap to it, and it does add safety margin. But on that motor, a 150 versus what that motor's making NA is not a lot. Do you know of any engine builders that specialize or work with 4200s to make big power? I don't. I don't know people that. We occasionally get people like Steve that comment because he's running one in a drag race application, but I don't know about direct builders though. Are there aluminum for the LA360 that don't have the push rod bosses protruding into the intake runner flow? I think if you got something like that, you'd be talking about an offset rocker head. Butcher's in the house. Did you get a chance to take a peek into the 2.5? Only the leak down test. Our Complimenter LA engines went through the lights at 10,400. See, there you go. You can make them. You can, with the right parts, you can make stuff rev. Is there a W style Magnum, like a W2 head for the Magnum stuff? Not that I know of. You should test UTA awesome, UT awesome performance. Those are the ones I was looking at last night. The performance kegger mods on the 360. And that's what I'm talking about. I'd like to see how effective that is. and then try other mods to see if there's anything else that you can do. Michael, I got a closer look at my BMW intake manifold. I thought it changed runner, but it actually switches between single and dual plane. So not single and dual plane, probably. It's probably just changing. It's probably just connecting the plenum, right? Anything planned with a 6.4 Hemi? I don't have one of those even to test. What about swapping stock EV1 injectors to EV6 4-hole for better fuel atomization? We've tried some of that testing and increasing fuel pressure and stuff to improve atomization. And maybe if you were testing it at an OEM level and you could test emissions and you could do some other things, we didn't really see very much in terms of power. But like I said, maybe fuel mileage. I don't know that that's the case because I haven't specifically tested that. I had the Mopar Performance 2-barrel M1 running stock. I had more top end than the beer keg intake. I also ran a supercharger, and that's where the M1 came alive. Top end was great either way. The Mopar Performance 2-barrel M1 intake is a single plane intake, right? Combustion chamber design affects swirl more than anything else. The one thing that affects swirl even more than combustion chamber design is the thing that like Honda does with valve timing. So on their 4-valve head, they open one valve before they open the other valve. You can also put swirl vanes in. You can some of them have intake manifolds that only open one port, and so you can swirl that way. But I like the way that Honda does it, and that's the way that they did it on the VX. Is you'd actually open one valve of the 2 intake valves before the other one, and that would induce swirl, and it works pretty well. I haven't heard of Republic camshafts for the Slant 6. I do need to get at least one camshaft for the Slant 6 too. I used the Speedmaster Magnum cast iron head on a Demolition Derby engine. That's perfect. HVAC professor done any testing with compressed air boost technology that came out a few years back? The guys want me to run that because it's the guys that used to own NOS that did the compressed air supercharger, and it's really, really cool. It's expensive and problematic, but it is awesome though. And the amount of gain that they're getting relative to the amount of pressure change is really impressive because the air temperature, the charge temperature is so cold. Nick, the Hughes EFI air gap intake is supposed to retain most of the Kegger's low end, but also open up the high end even more than the Mopar M1 intake. If it's a dual plane, it's typically they don't make as much power as a single plane on top when they're braided or when they're EFI. It doesn't matter how you're injecting the fuel in. A dual plane can, like when we test the dual plane stuff on an LS, the dual plane actually makes a lot of low speed power, surprisingly. Sometimes, like if we run a dual plane manifold on an LS, it makes more low speed power than the long runner truck manifold does. So it's certainly possible for a dual plane, like an air gap style intake manifold, to make as much low speed power as the Kegger might. Maybe not at 2,000, but I doubt that it would make the same top end as a single plane. But I haven't tested those, so that might be possible with those specific intake manifolds. James, your thoughts on putting a 383 Chevy aluminum head, 64cc, big valves, and a 96 Suburban with a stock intake and injection setup? On a 96? Is a 96 going to be the Vortec? I've heard guys had good luck with that. As long as you can tune it and get enough fuel to that 383, then it should work. I just don't have any experience with that. Dan, I'm familiar with the BMW continuously variable intake manifold. That thing was awesome. In regard to piston flip stuff, after you run the same timing, I'd suggest you try chiming sweeps again. I can imagine the way the piston dwells and not change where the peak pressure wants to be. We can run through timing sweeps on both of them and see. We can try that and see if it changes anything. Turbo 4.8 or all motor 6.0. If you already have the 4.8, Mike, just add boost to it. It's not even close as to which one of those would make more power and be less expensive. I mean, the Turbo 4.8 would be on almost no boost at all, would be way more than even a heavily modified 6-liter would do, as a heavily modified NA 6-liter. Landmine, dig your test. Hope you're making some money. Well, at least one of those. I'm happy that you like the test. Woodsy 74 Nova's out. Yeah, Michael, that's very common to have a divided plenum and they open and close it. And in some cases, I've seen them do that multiple times in different RPM ranges. .340 Dusters rule. I ran the Mopar Performance RT big valve heads with supercharger. Superchargers like that. Yeah, 6 into 1, 6 into 2 into 1. Yeah, they're just closing a divider. I know. I'd like to see a V8 Honda. So I imagine you talked about it, but what year is the 2.5 T1 you found? I think it's, I don't know what the year it is, but I think it's a common block. Oh, Julius, are you okay, man? Yeah, I'm really excited about the Omni, and I wish I hadn't sprayed brake cleaner all over the hood to when I was trying to rub it out. Dan, the swirl that I'm talking about wasn't for emissions and fuel mileage. And actually, in the case of the Honda, they were inducing swirl to try to get a homogeneous mixture because they were running lean burn. So it was ultra lean, which makes it really hard for the thing to light off sometimes. Tyler, I did see them reducing plenum volume by putting the plates in as well. Pulling my hair out, trying to find from Rocky, trying to find a way to make my Wine 177 work with a serpentine setup on my small block Chevy. I'm sure that that's possible because I know that they make, I mean, the Wine's already going to have, at the minimum, a 6-rib pulley on it. So you should be able to make that work, but it's probably going to be custom though. Wrecking Yard 6.4 Hemi. I've never seen, I haven't said I've never seen a 6.4 Hemi in there. I've never seen a 6.1 Hemi in the Wrecking Yard. I have seen a lot of 5.7s. Every one that I've seen, John, is an early 5.7. I find them in the Jeeps, and I find them in some of the Dodge cars too, like the Magnums and stuff. Could you do some part throttle testing? We can. The other thing that I might do on with the Magnum is, because it's fuel injected, we could do some fuel tests to see if there's a change in fuel temperature. And part throttle stuff would be good too. I'd like to do some 50% throttle angle stuff. Let's see, Tim. I like what Uncle Tony is doing with the 318. 5,500 RPM shifts. really low single plane intake, and a carb velocity stack that is 4 inches tall with underhood air and no air filter. The Holley torquer makes torque. The torquer has never worked when I've tested. I haven't tested the Dodge one, but on the Ford I tested the Performer, the torquer, the Victor Jr., and the RPM, and the torquer was not stellar. .57 versus 5.8 versus 5.9 Magnum. The Hughes plenum repair plate. I'll have to take a look at that. Is that just a thicker, lower plate? Project FO2, do you think the 360 Magnum stock internals can handle 600 horsepower turbocharge? I would say without a doubt it can. Us enthusiasts pay attention when you do these tests. That's what I'm doing it for, man. For you guys. Mike, I was wondering if the Dodge 4-cylinder turbo motors resemble the Mitsubishi. They do not. This is a 2-valve. They call it an 8-valve for 4 cylinders. It's a 2-valve head. It's not anything like any of the Mitsubishi stuff. Yeah, Tim's right. The later 2.4 stuff, the SRT4 and the PT Cruiser and those things would be much more like the Mitsubishi stuff. Can you test a 3.2 out of an Acura TL? I am going to do that engine series, a 3.2 or a 3.5. We probably won't get it out of an Acura TL. We probably will get it out of an SUV. Have you seen the 24-valve head that's available for the Datsun 240 L24 and the L26 and the L28? Yes, it's called an OS Geiken head, and it's about $1 million. And it doesn't add a lot of power, but it is awesome. I remember back when I had my stuff way back in the day, I remember lusting after those things. I thought it was awesome. If you're handy with sheet metal, you can bend an upside-down V, sandwich it between the bottom plate of the plenum to help direct airflow to the ports. You should experiment using a rotary valve instead of a butterfly valve for the throttle. Make it lower pumping losses at reduced throttle. Uh-oh, Julius, man. Accident with an implement behind the tractor. Oh, that's bad news, dude. Be careful. Get better, man. Nick, if you're at high elevation, that will definitely change the detonation threshold of the motor. And also, if it's just because you're like we ran all this testing with the nitrous and everything on 91 octane and without any problem. So we know that it will run NA on 87 octane without any problem. And the thing is, like I said, these things wanted very low timing. So it might be that if you don't know what your timing is, it's already low enough to run the low octane stuff. Yeah, Tim, I don't understand. The torquer is very old school. I mean, at least it wasn't a tarantula or, or something like that with the twisted car position, which is super cool looking. I have to admit, but that torquer was not great. At least the Ford one that I tried. The Honda J Series stuff runs 2 different bell housings. That's good information. I don't know if we'll be running all-wheel drive. So if we run a two-wheel drive, are we good? Do the Mopar 8-valve 4-cylinders have balance shafts? The 2.2s, the early ones did not. The 2.5s did, and then the later common blocks, I think, did on both of them. I could be wrong about the 2.2. I know all the 2.5s did. Can you liquid cool spark plugs to keep them from failing at high engine temperature? I think that'd be counterproductive. I don't think that the plugs fail from high temperature. Usually the plug doesn't fire for another reason. And given the fact that we've run, when I say we, I mean we as humans, have run them in pro stock motors and top fuel motors and Formula One motors and IndyCar motors and Bonneville motors and all that stuff. And they've worked the way that they work. I don't know that that would be necessary. You're going to try just 1.7 rockers. I have a set for mine. I haven't installed it. I'd love to see what it actually does. Are you talking about 1.7 rockers on the Dodge? Old school small block question, 355, 10-1, performer RPM heads, comp 268. That all sounds like good stuff. I have 4 of 1.5 rockers and 4 1.6 rockers. Currently, the 1.6s are on the intakes. That's where I would put them. When running E85 under boost, will a standard wideband system for gas work? Yes, we use the same one on the dyno. Some Porsche engines had slide valve intakes. I've seen them, and what they're trying to do is just get everything out of the way for the airflow. They just don't want the crossbar and the blade and the mounting bolts in the way of the airflow. So with a given orifice opening size, if you get rid of the blade, you increase airflow. Now, the thing is, if you had enough airflow already, the slide valve does nothing. If the port size with the blade and the flow rate of that throttle opening flowed enough to feed the head and the power output of the motor, adding more airflow might not do anything. And that's what a slide valve will give you. Would you do a rotary? Yeah, I would like to. I love rotaries. I think that they're awesome. And I've done lots of stuff on the chassis dyno with them, but I haven't ever run one on the engine dyno. I have to figure out how we hook one up. If somebody has a rotary to small block Chevy adapter plate, that would make life easier. Okay, Rocket Surgeon. So the later 2.2 common block stuff does have balance shafts as well. That's good. I'm not a fan of using rockers to increase cam lift by a bigger cam. The nice thing about doing the rocker test, though, is it's easy to do on the dyno. You don't have to take the motor apart. So if we put rockers on it, and that's an easy test, then we don't have to tear into the motor to do that. And a lot of guys will do that and not change the camshaft. They'll put rockers on it. And if they could get 10 or 15 horsepower from a rocker change, which they might be able to do on a stock cam, excuse me, then they're likely to do that, because all I have to do is to pull the valve covers for that. You don't have to disassemble the motor to do a cam swap. The one thing I can say about rockers, and it's the same thing with cams, is that you're on a Magnum, you're more than likely going to have to change the springs, because you want the thing to be able to RPM, and it's also going to have to work with whatever higher lift you're going to put in the camshaft. The other reason you'll need it, even if you do a rocker swap normally, is the rockers are going to be heavier than the factory rockers. And so if the rockers you're putting on are heavier than the factory rockers, you're going to valve float earlier, and which means that you need more spring rate. Mikey, my stroke 499 RB motor with TFS 240 heads makes best torque at 30 degrees of timing. Yeah, that's the thing. And a lot of guys like to talk about timing like, oh, yeah, I run 36 in mine. I'm like, great. Well, we run whatever the motor tells us that it likes and makes. I don't care what the number is. I don't have one locked in my head that I always have to run. All of that is nonsense. Just that's why we love doing it on the dyno, because the dyno tells us what the motor likes. And if it doesn't want more timing, like in this case, I would have thought for sure that a Magnum head would have been 29, 30, 31 degrees of total timing, but it didn't like that. So I didn't give it that. Yeah, my 1990 VNT LeBaron has balanced shafts since 2.2. The common block stuff did. I wouldn't buy the one area where I wouldn't recommend rockers for is an LS. I don't know why anybody would buy aftermarket rockers for an LS. That's the last thing I would ever recommend for anybody. I've seen the plates for the keg manifolds. I'd like to test one of those to see. I could probably make my own, just a quick Ritchie style, and I'm sure that it would show something. A 258 AMC straight six. The gentleman that I did the video with that had the 4200s and the 2Js that he had in the AMC has a straight six AMC that's sitting there. I don't know if it's a 258 or not. I'll have to ask him to see which one it is. Julius, I have a rotary to power glide bell housing for a 13B. You could have it when you get some more space. I have zero space. Random information. I heard that some America engine builders recently switched from using imperial measurements to metric measurements and managed to get much smaller piston rings as well. Small piston rings have been in racing for a really, really long time, and I don't think it has anything to do with the metric system. Surprised no one said head gasket deletes. Ruben, back in the day, I had a single cab 2002 Dakota. Mods were 2-barrel M1, 1.6 rockers, billet 2x52mm throttle bodies, long tubes, programmer, and nitrous 100 shot, and it ran 12.7 at 107. Nice. Do aluminum roller rockers make the oil temp hotter on a small block Chevy? I don't know why they would. In fact, a roller rocker probably should theoretically reduce friction between the tip and the roller. So if anything, you'd think that it would do the opposite. Are you going to be able to do a cam test on the 292 and or intake? I don't know about the lump ports on the 292, but definitely cam tests. Yeah, Tim, I think that they're trying to figure out a way to not have rings. How viable are fiberglass valve springs? I don't know that that's a. I remember way back in the day somebody tried carbon fiber Kevlar reinforced intake valve, and the motor started up and all of the valve went out the exhaust. It's pretty cool. I have a few 13B turbo kegs in my shop, not blown. Those are great. The turbo rotary stuff is awesome. Okay, 1 more minute, guys. But make sure to hit. Well, we have a lot of likes up there. I am excited about the Dodge stuff. As a matter of fact, I brought it home with me, and I'm gonna clean it off a little bit more too, because it's, even though it's, I tried cleaning it off once, but it's still a little bit dirty. But when I go ahead and do the intake swaps and stuff, I need to get some other gaskets for it, and we'll probably get head studs and stuff, just in case we run boost out, which we know we're gonna do. Have you used race car motor oil? Every motor oil that you buy is actually race car motor oil. Steve, in your opinion, are there any really good Mopar late model engines other than the new Hemi? Well, and that's the way that it is with almost any engine. Whatever the most modern version is obviously the best one. Guys are making lots of power with 383s and 440s and the early Hemis and LA motors. The guys have made a ton of power with those, and the Magnums as well. But the latest generation Hemi obviously is the most powerful, just like the latest generation of the Coyote is the most powerful, and the latest generation of the LT motor, which we're starting to scratch the surface on now, they make a lot of power. What upgrades would you do to stock rockers on LS? I would just run them. You might do a trunnion upgrade or something on that, but otherwise we would just run them. Tyler wants to know the best way to measure for correct pushrod length. With an LS, that video is up on how to measure for correct pushrod length. On a motor that has adjustable rockers on it, we can test pushrod length a different way. Keith, happy to do it, man. Be interesting to see stock ECU tune against dyno stand tune on a 360. As long as we could program the stock tune, if that's what you're talking about, or if you're just talking about whatever the stock tune was on the 360, I think it would make less. It's probably more conservative than what we run. Although at 27 degrees of total timing, I can't think it's going to be a whole bunch less than that. What's the cheapest and best LS cam for low-end torque? I don't know what a little one would be. The single overhead cam was Ford's strongest engine until the Coyote. Do you mean the original 427 camera motor? Because it never did very well. It was very hard to keep running and make work. We're not trying to get maximum power out of the 5.9. I just want to show what worked. Hey, what happens when we put these heads on? What happens when we put this cam on? What happens when we put this intake manifold on? It's more just an exercise to show people that are thinking about making a particular modification. Hey, what happens if I do this? I don't know. Let's ask Richard. He's probably done it before. So I'll test all that stuff. So you guys can go, well, if I want to do the Kegger mod, it's worth this. If we want to do a bigger throttle body or headers or nitrous or a blower or turbo or whatever, here's kind of what it does. It's almost never, hey, I'm going to make a 2,000 horsepower Kegger Magnum. That would probably get a lot of views if I had that up on YouTube. But that's not really what I'm doing. The Crane 200 cam was good. I don't know what kind of power. I just don't have any experience with the Magnum, but if it's like the other ones, it's going to be way up beyond what people think that they are. Okay, guys, I got to get going. Thank you for showing up. I will be back tomorrow. I'm editing. I got some Magnum videos going up, so that will be cool. Thanks for showing up, man. I'll see you tomorrow. do 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 do.